Welcome to part 2 of this special episode of Straight from the CPA's Mouth, featuring Robert Andrews CPA CMA. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to listen to part 1 of this podcast before joining us for part 2. My name is Sharon Ryder from CPA Alberta, and I'll be your host as we continue exploring the topics of equity, representation, and racism in the CPA profession and in Canada. As a Black woman, these topics are important to me on a personal and a professional level, and I'm honored to be hosting this discussion during National Indigenous History Month. Before I go on, I would like to acknowledge that CPA Alberta resides and serves on traditional and ancestral territories of many Indigenous First Nations and Inuit people. I'm hosting from Mohkinstsis or Calgary, which is situated on Treaty 7 territory. As an organization, we are committed to building a profession where Indigenous people and their voices and experiences are heard, valued, respected, and celebrated. Joining me again via Zoom is Robert Andrews, CPA CMA. Robert is the Executive Director for the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association of Alberta and is an Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Business at Athabasca University. Robert has dedicated much of his career to supporting Indigenous people who wish to embark on careers in business and accounting or enhance their management practices to improve their communities. Welcome back to Straight from the CPA's Mouth, Robert. Let's dive in.
150,000 new businesses are created in Canada each year, but only
emotional
51%
intelligence is a critical skill for leaders. How do I develop
artificial intelligence will take over analytics, big data, trend analysis?
Hearing that Alberta needs to diversify its economy, but how do we do that?
Create new opportunities for young innovators.
Businesses account for 77% of all private jobs
traded
created in
companies.
Canada.
Filter out the noise. Hear it straight from the CPA's mouth.
I'd love to dig a little deeper into that idea of meritocracy. And I want to connect it a little bit to your work as an educator and mentor to Indigenous students. But before I dive into that, would you like to just talk a little bit about that work that you do? Because I think there is a theme about, your experience when you first started in the halls, as you talk about, is in post-secondary and things like that. And so I'd love to talk about, maybe a little bit about your students' experiences, what you've seen. But yeah, maybe we can start by you just talking a little bit about your work as an educator and mentor to Indigenous students.
Yeah, the best job I've had, and I've had not too many jobs, but I've had a number of jobs. The role that I have, the organization focuses on teaching managerial capacity to Indigenous people. And that broader than just simply First Nation people, Indigenous people in Canada. So our focus within management, of course, is very broad, from accounting to human resource management, from finance to operations, the whole gamut of managerial training. And the reason for this is First Nations operate as governments. They are governments. And as governments, they have their own public administration, and they have their own, if you will, entities like crown corporations, tribal-owned businesses. So these managerial skills are necessary in their public administration and also their management of tribal-owned businesses. So what we do in our organization is develop programs and partnerships to help improve these necessary skills. So my role has multiple elements to it. I'm the executive director, which means I have oversight of and development of all the programs and initiatives, but I also am one of the educators. And so I actually work day-to-day with the Indigenous students teaching. And when I say students, they're usually mid-careers or often very senior career individuals in First Nation public administration. So my role on a day-to-day basis includes teaching these wonderful learners how to do accounting, how to manage conflict, how to develop financial statements, how to, the whole gamut of managerial function, what leadership is, kinds of leadership, qualities of leaders. And that's my engagement. So typically we work with, 20 individuals at a time over extended periods of time to teach these skills, but we also partner with organizations. So currently we have a partnership with Athabasca University to offer a program for Indigenous learners that's unique in that it was created by Indigenous scholars and taught by Indigenous people, and I'll lead to why that's so important. And then we also work with very large, prestigious institutions, in one case, Harvard, to develop training for Indigenous people in Canada and the US. And I had the privilege of help developing the curriculum for Harvard Business School for this group. So why is it important to have our organization and Indigenous educators and scholars? Well, very simply, our worldview as an Indigenous person differs from others and is based on certain beliefs, assumptions, contexts that are unique to the Canadian Indigenous people. Now, sometimes when I say something like that, I'll get pushback saying we're all unique. And fair enough, I wouldn't argue with that. But the First Nation people in Canada have had a defined, unique experience where they had settlement of their lands and they had treaties drafted with the government and their nations. And they were placed as a people in pockets, reserves, where they were governed by Indian agents for all of their core governance, cultural, regulatory context. So when I say Indigenous people are unique, they really do have a unique experience. There isn't in Canada a similar group that has this commonality of experience that makes them very homogeneous in terms of their experience. So the Indigenous scholar, the Indigenous instructor is able to relate to them with that understanding and relate to them in a very, very rich way. So that's my principal role with the organization is as sort of a designer of these programs that reflect Indigenous worldview and context, provides relevance to the managerial education, but also someone that shares that experience and that history. It's an extraordinarily rich experience. I can't describe the richness of that experience and the wealth of that culture and what a pleasant, wonderful experience it's been.
It sounds wonderful. So as you've been mentoring students during this time, you and as well as everyone that you work with, and you talked about how you've seen as a profession, CPA has done a lot to change in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion, and the experiences of your students and people entering the business profession. What changes sort of have you seen? Do you think that things are getting better? Do you feel like the students you work for have greater opportunity to show up as their full self, their full Indigenous selves in the business world or in the profession? How are you feeling? How do you see that the changes have been?
So changing policy is easy. Changing beliefs and values is very, very hard. And as I mentioned, the CPA as a profession, just like every other profession, is embedded in society and embedded in its policies, procedures, governance structures are these broader societal values. Now, we are starting to see, and very recently, like this discussion now is very different than it would have been 2 years ago, 18 months ago. So because of many of the things that happen in the States, we drew parallels with our experiences in Canada. And so I would say institutions absolutely are more sensitized to these issues associated with marginalized populations and Black and Indigenous Lives Matter, those kinds of things. And through these, let's call them social awareness, many people in society as well are starting to take notice of issues that they weren't aware of, privy to. And I think society is starting to change. I actually think the institutions are a little bit further ahead of society, probably because they're smaller groups, usually they're governance structures that have to believe that change is necessary and that change along these lines is healthy and good. So I would suggest that we've seen a significant number of advances in the last 2 years, and probably, even within the last year. So I certainly think and strongly believe things are improving. In terms of society, in terms of that overlay or underpinning of society in terms of the organizations, I still think we have many challenges there. And this goes back to the role of the institutions to help people move forward, move along, to understand more deeply. I don't want to suggest change people's ways of thinking, but I do want to suggest that we inform them better so they can change their ways of understanding. And in my heart of hearts, I believe that so many of these beliefs, tendencies, stereotypes are simply based on ignorance in the sense of not knowing, not understanding the history. And this is true of all marginalized groups. So I think that, again, the institution is improving. I think the universities as conduits to CPAs, because of course you have to go through universities, multiple programs within universities to become a CPA. I think they're also improving. I think there's tremendous opportunity to take that further, particularly at the post-secondary level, where they can formalize learning about not only the Indigenous population, but other populations that have similar kinds of experiences. So it's certainly better. I do think we have very, very, very far to go. But yeah, I definitely, absolutely think it's improving. The interesting part, again, is there's inherent tensions in these changes. And what we tend to do when we're stressed, either as a society or as an institution, as a person, to kind of go back to those earlier held points of view. So with COVID, we see the strains on society. So we spring back to earlier beliefs. And as much as COVID has taught us we're interconnected, COVID also created more racial disharmony. So I think we always have to be mindful that as tensions increase, we do have a tendency to go back. So I think we have to look at structures that disallow this to happen. So hopefully that also started to address some of your questions.
It did, yeah. So as you look ahead at, the continued work that needs to be done and still wrestling with some of the very real challenges and realities, what gives you hope about this work, about this situation, as we move towards hopefully a more equitable profession and society? What gives you hope?
Well, Sharon, I could not help hearing that question with a sigh. And as a person that I know has experiences not dissimilar, what do you think? I heard from that kind of almost like a recognition of the challenge we have to face and the hurdles we still have ahead of us, and how much we pay lip service to some of these things, but know in our hearts that a lot of things haven't changed. So tell me what you think.
Yeah, I think that often it's hard to think about it in the sense of hope, to be honest. I'd be lying if I didn't feel pretty hopeless about a lot of this a lot of the time, even similar to you as I work within my community, as I, organize and advocate and things like that. I do think that even at times, like even last year, there was a period where I was like, wow, like this is, come on, right? But I think that even if there is an absence of hope, sometimes I still have to hold on to the idea that there is something to work towards, that there are people who are going to come after me that I hope won't have to work as hard or be as exhausted, or, that there's going to be that little glimmer. So I think that gives me hope. I think the community gives me hope as, people come together in different ways, but definitely maybe that was the sigh you heard, where it's tough. It sometimes feels like an endless sort of slog.
Sharon, I agree for so many reasons, and I hope we can actually carry on a little bit more of this discussion, because it's going to tell us authentic things about our experiences. And what people don't appreciate is how pervasive these issues are. And they run right from the institution right down to the small remarks that clerks make. when you're, checking out at a drugstore. And the pace of change, I mean, there's change and there's a superficial change, but people don't recognize the underlying issues, and they think that somehow. So an example of this, and this is a kind of racism, is that this group wants to help you. And right off the bat, there's a racist quality in that. And they don't recognize it. It's coming from a good place. It's saying, I get you, which they don't, but that's okay. I want to help you, which comes from a place of, like, I like you, I care about you. But the notion that I will want to help you, I can help you, suggests a type of superiority. And it suggests they really don't get it, because their help is just a different kind of imposed solution on our communities. And they don't understand that our solutions have to come from us. And we have to be empowered and enabled to develop our solutions, because those reflect our worldviews, and those reflect our traditions and our beliefs and our kin, clans, or relationships with each other, and their desire to help. It's another form of hurting without recognizing those things. So is that part of what you also experience with this apparent change in views?
Yes, definitely. I think it really ties into a lot of what you were saying of on a system and policy level. I think a lot of times there is the desire to create change in ways that change has been created in the past. And so rather than thinking about, okay, maybe the way that we've built this in the past doesn't work or serve, those who are most in need of this change, I think that the real work, it's a lot harder to say, let's just not go into those same patterns again. Let's not tap into the same sort of processes or policies again and just reconstruct a whole way of being. But that's very challenging and threatening, I think, in institutions, because they are institutions, right?
Absolutely. And this is where this stuff is so much trickier than we recognize. It's not simply about a level of awareness about another group's experiences. It's really understanding those people, whoever those people are, however you define those people. So whether we're talking about the Indigenous people or whatever, and really understanding and coming at things as best they can from their point of view. But there's another trap in here, and this is the trap of the educated person. And the educated person thinks they understand, because of their intellect, the experiences and implications, and are able to extrapolate into another person's life. And you can't. I mean, I've fallen trapped to that. I had certain beliefs, like I tend to support, not tend to, I very much strongly support human rights, individual rights. And the LGBTQ2 community is another very marginalized group. And I had the arrogance to think that I understood enough about this community for my own position as a marginalized person, until I got to know very well a gay man. And I realized I had no real depth of insight into his worldview, his experiences, and things that we just take for granted were shocking to me. And that was the curse of the educated person. I thought I knew better. And as a result, I thought I could possibly come up with solutions that would work for others. And truly I couldn't. So the example he had, which just shocked me, and it was so fundamental, it never even occurred to me. I hold hands with my spouse down the street whenever she desires. He can't, because of fear of being attacked physically. And it never occurred to me that something so basic in my context would have such a different implication in his context. So I think this is a bit of the curse of the educated person that we carry. Back to your thoughts, Sharon, there are many, many, many good people trying to help. but it's understanding sometimes their help hurts. And also their views are still not sufficiently informed that they can provide with any great insight the kinds of interventions that would be helpful. And so the interventions probably that are most helpful are addressing some of the inequity in the so-called meritocracy. It's removing some of these barriers that are associated with education. It's understanding and trying to teach all the flavors of racism, individual racism, systemic racism, institutional racism, and recognizing these things and be prepared to hold them up to the light and say, if we look really hard and we listen to people and what they tell us, there's challenges here. So I think another part of moving forward has to be that those of us that are in these populations must be heard for what we say in these institutions and society. And when I was originally approached to speak on this, I really wanted a person that was not of the dominant culture to share the discussion, because they have an appreciation of this that other people simply do not have. And there's an authenticity, a sharing of our experiences that simply are not held by someone that hasn't experienced these things. And the pain that I talked about and how it's a constant attack. People don't understand that. So we have to be heard. If we say this is a problem, they can't go away and analyze what we said and come back with their interpretation. I was at a session on ethics for academics, and one of the points was that Indigenous data is owned by Indigenous people. And this was really hard for the academics to accept. And it was not there, they own the data. And it's like, no, one of our rights is to own that data and understand and interpret it. And they struggled with this. And I said, well, let's contrast this. Let's look at gender issues. I said, how would you feel if I, as a male, came into this room and said to a group of females, tell me about your issues? And so they thoughtfully explained their issues. And I looked at them and said, oh, great. I'm going to take that and I'm going to go away and I'm going to meet with a panel of men and we're going to fix your problems. And they recognized the absurdity of that. And so as an institution, as organizations, as structures, there's a similar thing that takes place. When you speak, Sharon, when I speak, they say, oh, great, we'll go away and we'll figure out what you really meant and we'll figure out how to fix your challenge. And it simply doesn't work. We have enough history to know that doesn't work.
I often think about the phrase a seat at the table. And sometimes I believe there's this idea that, okay, we'll add more seats with with different people around. But sometimes I feel like what actually needs to happen is people should give up their seat at the table or stand up and take themselves away from the table and let those seats be taken up by the group or the people that they're trying to help or advance.
And that goes right to the core of it. I mean, having more seats at the table means there'll be more voices for the dominant culture to take away and analyze and come back with their solutions. Where if we have representation and acceptance of what we're saying is authentic, legitimate, valuable, and an understanding that, Sharon, you've expressed a lot of really important ideas and things that we need to address. Now, can you help us come up with solutions that would work for you and some process that we could apply these? So rather than saying, we'll take your problems and we'll come up with solutions for you, how can we empower you to address the things you think ought to be addressed? How can we resource you sufficiently that you can move these things forward? How can you give legitimacy to the voice of you and your community that reflect all of those important things you talked about and bring them into our organization to make it stronger and better? And really speak to the notions of diversity and inclusion and equity. Whereas having more people at the table doesn't help if they don't have a voice. And more people without voices, you just need a bigger room. It doesn't move anything forward.
Oh, for sure. Thank you, Robert, for joining us for the second installment of our 3-part episode on racism, equity, and representation. I hope our listeners will join us next week for the last segment of this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the Straight from the CPA's Mouth mailing list for exclusive content. If you have ideas for future episodes or have any feedback you'd like to share, email us at knowledgecenter@cpaalberta.ca or leave us a comment on social media. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about the HESI CPA Knowledge Center, check us out online at cpaalberta.ca/foundation.
Straight from the CPA's Mouth is brought to you by the CPA Education Foundation. The CPA Education Foundation is the charitable arm of the Alberta CPA profession, providing up to $1.2 million each year in support of business and accounting education in the province. This podcast is just one of many resource materials available through the HESI CPA Knowledge Center. This virtual hub features Alberta CPAs sharing their unique perspective and vast expertise on topics and issues such as leadership, finance, entrepreneurship, and more. Visit cpaalberta.ca/foundation for more information on the HESI CPA Knowledge Center and to learn how Alberta CPAs inspire success.